Okay, so in this lesson, we are going to talk about social justice, especially as it relates to the workplace. Now, the reason why a lesson like this for Introduction to Co-op is important is because no matter what environment you are going to be placed into, wherever you're going to work in a professional setting, you need to be aware of how your own identities, your own biases, color the lens in which that you see the world and the things that are happening around you. And so my goal today is to equip you with the skills to help you be more aware of your own identities, your own biases, and what you bring to the workplace. So some ground rules before we get going that are pretty important to talk about. Number one is that conflict and discomfort are going to be a part of this conversation and is a part of the growth that is necessary for us all to learn and learn together. We all have biases and baggage. We bring lots of different experiences with us, lots of different identities and who we are, and that is an important aspect of social justice education. The trick, though, is for us to pay attention to all those biases and all that baggage that we bring with us and how that affects how we react to certain concepts talked about when we talk about social justice. And lastly, believe it or not, we all have privilege. You may sit there and think that I don't have any privileges, I've never really felt any sort of privileges in life, but the mere fact that you're at a university learning about engineering, going into the co-op workforce, affords you a certain level of privileges that others in our society, in this world, that they do not have. And so sometimes those privileges are things you cannot see and cannot feel and don't necessarily feel like that you've ever really used them in life, but that's the thing with privilege, is that it's unearned. Lastly, I want to make sure that we understand that the conversation that we're going to talk about in this video is contextual. Social justice education is going to look different depending on where you are in the world. And so for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to talk about the United States because identities are socially constructed. They are constructed through the experiences that we have, the cultures that we've grown up in, the people that we've interacted with. And so all of those pieces play a part into developing who we are. And so who we are here in the United States is very contextually based. It's different than who others are going to be in different countries. And really essentially how this plays a part with social justice education is that when we start talking about dominant groups in the United States may look different than a dominant group elsewhere in the world. And that's an important aspect. And when we start talking a little bit more about identities later on, that will become much more apparent to you. For this online video, I'm going to have you use a worksheet that I'd like you to download and utilize for reflection purposes. Alright, so in the first part of the worksheet, I want you to jot down your thoughts on what you believe is the difference between valuing diversity and valuing inclusion. Not necessarily what the differences between those two words are, certainly we'll talk about that, but when a company says we value diversity, what does that mean? If a company says that we value inclusion, how is that different? So let's define some terms so that we're all on the same page when we talk about different aspects of social justice. First, what is diversity? Diversity is that wide variety of shared and different personal and group characteristics amongst human beings. It's all the different things that make us who we are. Now, diversity can be of thought, it can be of physical appearance, it can be other characteristics, but it's certainly that wide variety. Versus inclusion, which is the idea that individuals and groups are welcome, accepted, and appreciated for who they are no matter what their identity. So no matter what the levels of diversity that there are, inclusion brings all of those different aspects of diversity together and appreciates, accepts, and welcomes them into the fold no matter what those identities are. Again, I'd like you to return to your worksheet and reflect for a moment on what you believe the word privilege means and what you believe the word oppression means. Alright, so let's define some of these terms as well. Privilege is an unearned power enjoyed by a dominant group, giving them economic, political, social, and cultural advantages at the expense of members of a subordinated group. Now, the terms dominant and subordinated I'll go over in a minute, but those are important terms. Notice that we don't use majority and minority, we use dominant and subordinated groups. So if privilege is unearned power enjoyed by a dominant group, especially with regard to economics, political issues, social and cultural advantages, then what is exactly oppression? How does a dominant group oppress a subordinated group? Oppression is the idea that one group is somehow better than another and in some measure has the right to control the other group. So a dominant group feels that they are better than a subordinated group, and they feel they have the right to control that other group. All of the power that comes along with both economic and political issues, and then the cultural and social capital being controlled by a dominant group. So let's return to our worksheets one more time, and I'd like you to reflect on how might oppression be institutionalized or systemic, especially as it relates to the workplace. So what is institutionalized oppression? Well, if you take that dominant group that had the idea that they are better than and have the right to control the subordinated group, when that idea gets embedded in the institutions of our society, like laws, the legal system, police practice, the education system in schools, hiring policies, public policies, housing development, media images, political power, and so many other things, when the idea that one group is better than and has the right to control another group, when that happens, you've created institutionalized oppression. It's no longer necessary for an individual to oppress another individual or a group of individuals. When it is institutionalized, it happens regardless of what individuals will do. And this can be seen in all sorts of different areas of society. So let's break down what dominant and subordinated group membership looks like. So in this context, we'll talk about men and women. Between men and women, the dominant group is men, and they generally see themselves as normal and superior over the subordinated group, and in our case here is women. Women are considered different, substandard. And for example, how this gets institutionalized is that women haven't really had access to higher education or top institutions until very recently. In fact, many of you watching this video would not be sitting here watching this video today if it was just a few decades ago. And that may seem like a long time, but it really wasn't in the grand scheme of things as far as the relationships between men and women. And so the right to vote, the right to attend higher education, the right to hold certain offices in certain institutions. Just only in 1943 did the College of Engineering at the University of Cincinnati start allowing women to take courses. And so all of these things kind of play a part into institutionalized oppression between men and women. Dominant groups create norms and structures that benefit themselves versus subordinated groups where they need to assimilate to the dominant group's norms in order to advance. And so in our society, here in the United States, again, everything's contextual. Women don't actually have paid maternity leave. That's not a right that they are afforded when they become pregnant and have a child. And so in order to take time off to be with, to have a baby, to recover from having a baby, and then of course to raise that baby, you're afforded, the U.S. government has said that women have the right to have 12 weeks. It's called FMLA, Family and Medical Leave Act, and only 12 weeks to be able to do that, and it's unpaid. They're just guaranteed that that company can't fire them, because in the past that has happened. When women became pregnant in the workplace, they were let go from their roles, or if they had delivered a baby, the job that they had when they returned from recovering from having the child wasn't there for them anymore. And so in order to protect their rights as individuals in this country, the government created FMLA. And it says that women have the right to have that job after they return from maternity leave. However, it's unpaid. Women don't get paid for that time. They have to take sick or vacation if they have enough. And if they don't have enough, then it's unpaid work. And so that is an institutionalized structure or benefit that not necessarily benefits men, but is certainly not a detriment to them. Dominant group membership, they know little about the life and reality of subordinated group members. For example, I have no idea what it's like to give birth to a child or what it must be like to go through that process, carrying a child for 9 months while you're working. But subordinated group members have to know a lot about the dominant group in order to survive in that industry. And you can kind of imagine that boardroom with a bunch of guys and a few women and then, terms thrown around like being told to man up, or how often do we use sports references in business settings like, oh, we're at the 5 yard line, we're almost there, it's the ninth inning. And sometimes those terminologies, because they're masculine in nature, because of the sport that they're associated with, are not really appropriate for women. And that's not saying that those terminologies shouldn't be used, but you can see how institutionalized that dominant and subordinated sort of mentality has become. Dominant groups control the resources, whereas subordinated group members have limited access to resources. And for example, the USA government is controlled predominantly by men. Most men are in elected office. We've never had a woman president. Women haven't actually run for the presidency until very recently. And so you can see that just even the control, even over laws and how we are governed, is predominantly done by men. Dominant group membership have unearned advantages and privileges. And again, these advantages and privileges are unearned. We didn't ask for them, certainly. I'm a man and I haven't asked to be in this dominant group, but I definitely benefit from being in this organization, or being in this group. I've never been told that I couldn't be the President of the United States simply because of my sex. I might have been told that I couldn't be the President of the United States because of other reasons, but never because I was a man that I couldn't do it, whereas women, that would happen to them quite frequently. Subordinated groups must work extra hard for those advantages, and they have to get extra education, or they have to make sure that they have extra money, whereas I don't necessarily need to do that as a man or someone with privilege. Dominant groups are unconscious of their privilege and how it is embedded in the structures of society. And this can be seen in all sorts of different ways, but it may also feel that way to you right now, listening to this and watching this video. You may be sitting there going, I don't have any privileges. I've had to work hard for everything in my entire life, and I don't understand what this guy's talking about. This is a load of baloney. And that may be true for you, but the thing to really consider is, how did all of the things that have aligned for you to be where you are, how did they come to alignment? Were you the unconscious recipient of some sort of privilege that you may not know about? And again, I'm not saying that there was and that you should be ashamed of that, but you should acknowledge that and be aware that we carry around with us this, what they refer to as the invisible knapsack of privilege, and that it can happen. Again, for me, I'm in most of those dominant groups. I am a man, I'm white, I have all sorts of different privileges that have been afforded to me because of those. And so certainly I have more privilege than others. But again, because we're all here today at a university setting, you could safely assume that we all have some level of privilege that others don't. Subordinated groups are painfully conscious of their lack of privilege and the unfriendly norms to which they must conform. I've never been followed around in a designer clothes store, but individuals, non-white individuals who go through stores do feel that way. I've never had that feeling. I've never had a feeling of being unsafe around other men, whereas women typically experience that. And then finally, dominant groups see discrimination as individual actions of other people that have nothing to do with them, whereas subordinated groups identify patterns of behavior quickly because of repeated treatment. And so, for example, if you are in a dominant group, you generally say things like, no one in my family ever had, slaves, so I don't understand why that affects me, or why that is something I should feel ashamed about. And again, it's not about shaming in any way, but those individual actions of others, again, it's institutionalized. And so when you start to look at social justice, education in the eyes of institutionalization, of oppression and privilege, then you can start to understand that it's not me as an individual that is bad or has done something wrong because of my privilege. It's an institution that I'm benefiting from and others are not. And there might be something I might want to be aware of. All right, one last time, let's go to the identity chart worksheet. There is a section, a table with lists several identities, and I'd like to go through all of them, talk about what the dominant group, what the subordinated group is, and then what's the associated ism with that. I believe this will be helpful for you to create context around the different identities folks may have within the workplace that may be important for you to identify. one of the first identities we'll talk about is sex. We've already talked about that one. Now, you'll notice if you've already taken a gander that down lower you'll see gender listed, and I list them separately, and they are separate identities. And so let's talk about sex first. Sex is some people will refer to as the biology, or they'll talk about chromosomes, and there are men and women. But you can also safely assume that sex is conforming as well. So I am a man, and I recognize that I am a man. I've never had to question whether or not I'm a man or not. And if that is something that has happened to an individual, they might be in a subordinated group. But for the most part, as far as sex is concerned, men and women are the two groupings in that identity, and men are the dominant group and women are the subordinated group, and the ism for that is, of course, sexism. For race, we're talking about white individuals in the dominant group and non-white individuals in the subordinated group, and then racism is the ism for that. Sexual orientation, when we start talking about how individuals orient themselves to different sexual identities, heterosexual is the dominant group, and homosexual would be the subordinated group, and the ism associated with that would be heterosexism. Some people may throw in homophobia as an ism in there, even though it doesn't have the ism sort of suffix, but and that's okay. Homophobia would be the fear of individuals who are homosexual, or the idea or what they perceive as homosexuality. And that's okay as well to consider that as the ism. It's not necessarily the fear and hatred of homosexuals as is homophobia, but heterosexism would be the fear and hatred of individuals who are homosexual and the institutionalized oppression of those individuals. Body size is an identity that's quite important in our society, especially here in the United States. And this one's a little bit confusing because you generally want to think of body size, right, as a certain shape. And so most folks would say thin, average, or athletic built. Those types of words to associate with the dominant group in this country. Again, I think sometimes we get confused when we talk about dominant versus majority. Some people might think that in this country the majority of individuals are obese. I actually don't know the latest statistics on that. Individuals who are in the size accepted group are the dominant group, and individuals who are size non-conforming, or you could say fat or obese, are in the subordinated group, and the ism associated with this is sizeism. For age, the dominant group is the young, and now that's a big category, and we're not talking about the ultra young. We're generally talking about individuals between the ages of 18 and 55, which is the age of being able to vote in this country, 18 to 55, which is generally accepted as the lower level of retirement. And so the subordinated group is old. Some would say that the ultra young are also subordinated because the young, or the middle years, have some institutional power over the old and over the ultra young. But for the most part, the two groups we're thinking about are the young and the old. And the ism associated with this is ageism. Now, here's an interesting category to think about when you consider your identity, is your ability level. Now, the subordinated group in this pairing is easy to understand. It's any individual who has a disability or the disabled. We try to do person-first language with this, and so we try to say individuals or people with disabilities. You put the person first as opposed to disabled people. But any way you put it, the subordinated group is going to be individuals with disabilities. Now, the dominant group, people would generally say are able-bodied. But I like to throw out that we are temporarily able-bodied, because right now you might consider yourself as able-bodied. You're able to walk around on your own power and do those types of things. But at any moment, your identity as able-bodied can change in an instant. It's actually the only identity that you have that can change instantaneously from one category to another. And so if you were in an accident, God forbid something happened to you, you could go from being able-bodied to disabled very quickly. And that is something that I think we should all really consider when we consider how the dominant group, the temporarily able-bodied, oppress and subordinate disabled individuals. And of course, the ism associated with ability is ableism. For class, the dominant group is the upper class. We don't generally throw around the economics of that, so we're not going to put a price tag on that. But any individual who has wealth and means above and beyond others, in the subordinated group here being the lower class or the working class. And the ism associated with class is classism. And then finally, I told you before, we talked about sex and gender are different, and here's the difference. Again, if we go back to sex and we talk about the biology of it, men and women, and then the two categories of it, whereas gender, all the different identities that gender can constitute. And so if you have transgender or intersexed, well, really what we're talking about sometimes as well is cisgender, which is generally speaking that I have, as a man, never questioned that I'm a man, and I am okay with being able to do that. I am gender conforming. In some cultures, women, in this country, women are to wear dresses and have long hair and cannot do anything else. And if they wear pants or dress in other ways, have short hair, don't wear makeup, they are actually gender non-conforming. So they'd be in the subordinated group regardless of their identity as a woman. And so anytime you have gender conforming norms, that would be the dominant group, considering that we feel that, or individuals in that group feel that this is how gender should act and feel and look. And anytime you have something that is not that, is gender non-conforming. It's really how people choose to identify. And so individuals who have gone through different transitions with their gender, how they choose to identify, enables us to create a whole new level of categories that are much more complex but much more open than just sex, which is men and women. And of course, the ism we associate with this is genderism. All right, so that really concludes our lesson on social justice and talking about privilege, oppression, and identity. This was a quick video just trying to give you, again, an awareness so that you can be equipped with hopefully some skills and knowledge to be able to go out there into the workplace and understand that you have an identity that you bring with you, biases that you bring with you, and privileges that you bring with you to those institutions, and how you are part of that or not part of that will impact your level of success, your level of happiness, and how you connect with the field of engineering, especially as you move forward. I have some homework that I'd like you to do. There is another worksheet that I'd like you to download and fill out before our next class. And I'd like you to try and go through the different identity levels and reflect about how you identify. So that should be just kind of going through and, for example, sex. If, for me, I would write that I'm a man, and I would put that. But when and how did you first become aware that that was an identity that I had? At what point did you realize? If I'm using my example, at what point did I realize that I'm a man? And how do others treat you based on this identity? So how do others treat me based on my identity as a man? And then what do you wish others knew about you based on this identity? And so is there something that I wish other people would know about my identity as a man that I think is important? And I'd like you to fill out as much as you can and bring this with you to class. There are some other boxes down below if you have some other identities that you'd like to put out there, and so that others can know a little bit more about you, and I would certainly encourage you to do that. We will discuss this in class. Thank you very much, and I hope that you learned a little bit more about social justice education, especially as it relates to the workplace.